So I'm Chris Cooper. I'm co-founder and executive director of Responsible Technology Australia. I want to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak. I'm grateful for the opportunity. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that every day we meet and work on Aboriginal land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Given that so much what I'm speaking about today is about the use of personal data, I want to make mention of the important work being done by people of colour in this country who are highlighting the way that data and surveillance have been used throughout history as a tool of oppression, and that this oppression of vulnerable communities continues today. And I think this is an important conversation for us to be thinking about. So what are we talking about today? I'm going to talk through some of what we call digital threats to democracy. I'm going to pick on big tech as responsible, in part, for those threats. Though it is worth noting that these issues don't just sit with big tech. They're a manifestation of bigger issues. But I do also want to speak to solutions and what we think is the beginning of an approach to effective regulation around these harms. So RTA is a research and advocacy organization that we've set up to raise awareness and advocate to counter the harms caused by exploitative data practices that impact our democracy. Admittedly, there are many issues within this area that we're concerned with. Everything from the impact on mainstream media to the impact on trust in institutions and leadership, through to conspiracies and misinformation and everything in between. It's a massive issue area. And I'll speak to some of those today, but I also want to focus on specific examples of how these harms have manifested through COVID. And I do think that there is a need to kind of counter some of the criticisms that we get from our opponents in this work. And one is that we're anti-tech, which couldn't be further from the truth. There is this kind of attitude that regulation of tech means that you're against tech, and it's easy to kind of throw the Luddite label around. I mean, we do have that thrown at us sometimes, but really it couldn't be further from the truth. I remember the kind of utopian promise that tech and the internet brought, and I notice now that our depictions of the future in a lot of our culture and literature is much more dystopian now, and I think that's in part because we have started to see some of the harms caused by tech in ways that we didn't really anticipate. But really, I think that that utopian promise of tech and the internet and all the things it was going to do to better connect people and communities and improve our lives and strengthen democracies, and put the world's information at our fingertips is all still true and really important. And our work is focused on supporting that kind of tech and enabling it, but while also being able to call out the unaccountable and the irresponsible tech companies that ultimately put corporate profits above all else and at the expense of social harm, social good. And so this isn't a dichotomy of good tech and bad tech. It's just way more complex and nuanced than that. So, for example, we've been doing a lot of thinking around the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think this moment really articulates the complexity of this in a really poignant way. In that, off the back of the murder of George Floyd, we've seen social media do what it sort of originally intended to do, which is it was a tool to shine a spotlight on injustice and inequality, while also allowing communities to organize and mobilize. And that really was why these platforms were created, to foster that kind of community building, and that kind of civic participation. But we've also seen through this moment the way that big tech and social media can foster hate speech and violence, can drive polarization, and can amplify misinformation that causes further harm to these movements and to the people affected by racism. So it's difficult when we start talking about these problems, about working out where to start. But it makes sense to kind of go back to what we think is the root of the problem, which is your personal data. So social media companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and the rest, collect so much of your personal data that often they know more about you, your interests and desires than your close friends do. This goes beyond just knowing where you work or who your family members are or what music you're into. In many cases, these companies know the park where you have playtime with your kids. They know how you're feeling emotionally, and they can infer intimate personal information like medical conditions or pregnancies, and sometimes even before you know. And that's partly because of the way that we surf the internet, and it's the way that we engage with social media. We do it in a very uninhibited way, where we have this sort of approach that it's sort of private and consumed, but also that we're viewing the public square. And those two pieces are things that play into some of these problems. But these platforms don't just know all of this about you, they know all of this about all the people you're connected to as well. And it's that collective use of data that becomes a new problem. So we all know about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but you may not know just how valuable that data is. So there's a 2015 study which largely informed the Cambridge Analytica approach, that they then used stolen Facebook data to deploy. And this study found that based off the data and personality insights from just your Facebook profile, they could accurately evaluate your personality with actually minimal data. And this is again due to the way that you interact on social media. So looking at only your clicks on Facebook, the team were able to evaluate your personality as accurately as a coworker with as few as just 10 likes. They were able to assess your personality as accurately as a friend with 70 likes, and they could get as close to knowing you and the kind of personality type that you are as your spouse with just 300 likes. So this is an example of how intense this data can be, and when it's gathered at mass scale, the kind of insights it can bring. And so those researchers were also able to predict whether someone was suffering from depression, even if they weren't aware of it. They're able to tell if someone was a drug user. They're able to infer what people studied at school. The site for this is still up. You can actually go and download your Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn data, plug it in, and see how the digital profile that these platforms have on you is accurate or not. I don't recommend you do it. I think you should hold onto your data safely and carefully, but it's an interesting exercise anyway to go and see it. So the platforms don't use all this data necessarily for nefarious purposes. Their priority is really to use it to hold your attention more than anything. So at this point, they know so many intimate details about you. They know, and so they also know how to keep you engaged. And that's what they do. They use these personal insights to recommend a constant stream of tailored content to keep you online and clicking. It's actually at the core of their business model. And the most engaging content tends to be the more outrageous, sensational, and conspiratorial, because it's the content that moves you emotionally. And so when the platforms know so much about you, it's easy to feed you these recommendations, and they can play into your vulnerabilities and to your existing worldview in ways that were sort of unintended. This has made your attention and your data the most sought after resources in the digital economy. And that's because while your attention is being held, the platforms can do two things. The first is that it enables them to serve you targeted ads and content from anyone who wants to pay for access to those insights. And the other is so that they can gather yet more data on you and insights of behavior to feed into that system. And that is the business model. So on one hand, this means you get recommended the content you want while getting served ads that are relevant. But it's when this arrangement becomes the norm throughout your online experience that it starts to send you down information sort of echo chambers that reinforce pre-existing beliefs while exposing you to the potential for manipulation by anyone willing to pay for access to those insights. At RTA, we break this down in two ways. The first is what we call intentional manipulation. And so that's where unvetted advertisers, organizations, or individuals Pay the platforms to push you content intended to sell you their products, their worldviews, or their ideologies. So with strategic targeting and enough money, it's possible to target you with highly niche content that plays on your emotions, your fears, or your hopes, and can tap into those vulnerabilities. The other side of this is what we call consequential manipulation, and that's the unintended byproduct of these platforms. So as the algorithms are geared entirely for your engagement, they don't make decisions based on how they're engaging, just that you are engaging. So whether you're liking a racist post because you're awful or commenting on it because it's outrageous, the algorithm sees both of those actions as engagement and reason to push the content to more people like you. This is why the outrageous, sensational, conspiratorial content rules on social media, and it's fundamentally changing the way that we relate to ourselves, each other, and truth. There are numerous ways that this is manifesting into unintended consequences and real world harms. I'm going to name just a few here that we're particularly interested in at RTA, which is 1, foreign interference in democracies, 2, threats to the safety of children and young people, and then 3, the amplification and legitimization of fringe and extremist voices. What we see in terms of foreign interference in elections is that either through the gaming of algorithms, tapping into sensation and outrage, or simply using the ad platforms, disinformation campaigns are being waged to destabilize and influence democratic processes. We saw this through Cambridge Analytica. They did it very effectively. So they influenced numerous elections around the world to suppress votes and undermine the process. They did this through Brexit, and they did it through the 2016 US election as well. In that election, we also saw Russian state-backed influence pushing sponsored ads and the infiltration of community groups to drive polarization through disinformation and antagonistic false news. We've seen China use Twitter to spread content to discredit Hong Kong protesters and their cause. Here in Australia, we've seen internet troll farms drive xenophobic content to provoke outrage and solely to drive revenue to their fake news websites. The result of this is an increase in division and polarization in communities. Ultimately, to sort of sum that up, it's essentially that anyone who's willing to pay or deploy the time on these platforms has access to the hearts and minds of Australians, and there's no oversight over this. There's no government body. There's no accountability around that mechanism. These unaccountable algorithms also drive unintended harm that manipulates the kind of vulnerabilities and impressionable mindsets of young people and children. The most tragic example of this is a young girl in the UK called Molly Russell. She was a 14-year-old girl who was already feeling depressed and anxious for a range of reasons. Part of that was because of the way that social media platforms drive this kind of social comparison and public gratification like culture that is affecting so many young people. And so she turned to those same platforms for help and support. But rather than sort of plugging into the kind of, positive communities of support that do exist, she went to Instagram and she started looking up dieting advice, dieting videos. And what the algorithm then did for her was started recommending her more and more of that content, and slowly took her down this rabbit hole towards pro-anorexia content and materials, and then eventually to self-harm content. And tragically, at the end of that, Molly took her own life. And so it's a really powerful and terrible example of the way that, the sort of unintended consequences of these algorithms left unchecked can have really terrible outcomes. But we've also seen young children exposed to graphic and violent, disturbing content through the YouTube platform. We also know that social media platforms open the door to radicalization of young minds through that echo chamber effect, where it amplifies fringe ideologies and normalizes these views through repetition. But this isn't just about malicious actors. The platforms enable these harms. Here in Australia, Facebook was caught out putting together a proposal for advertisers showcasing their capability to target vulnerable teenagers. So as conspiracy sells better than truth, we're also seeing the proliferation of extremist voices and the rise of fringe groups like never before. The algorithms put people into echo chambers where extremist voices are amplified and opposing or nuanced perspectives are rejected. This in turn slowly builds the false sense of public consensus, which is changing the worldview of users. Examples of this are in the amplification of anti-vax concerns by fringe groups, with studies showing that half of parents have been exposed to misinformation. My son was born last year, and one of the first things I did was to Google, when do I vaccinate my boy? And for weeks following that, I was served content which was like anti-vax in nature. So I've seen it firsthand. YouTube amplification has also been blamed for the rising number of people who believe in the flat earth theory. And there are examples of Holocaust deniers using the platform to spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well. So these harms are serious during peaceful times, but they take on new life during intense social and political moments like elections, natural disasters, or a global pandemic. And it's because at those times, it's when people most need reliable, credible, and trusted information. I mean, our elections are built on the idea of a well-informed, engaged constituency. But when you have misinformation and conspiracy thriving, it undermines that process. So through COVID, I'm sure we've all seen the fake news and the misinformation that's being pushed around the pandemic. Some of it is pretty benign, right? It's drink lots of water and to wash the virus into your stomach and let your stomach acid kill it. Some of it is dangerous. So it's telling people that they should gargle bleach to prevent infection. And some of it is destabilizing, that our government is hiding information from us, that the virus was created intentionally, or that we should panic. So one side of that consequential manipulation through COVID has been that because the platforms prioritize the more conspiratorial, outrageous content, because it's more engaging, it's meant that conspiracies have exploded through COVID. So after every pandemic we've had, there's been a narrative in fringe groups around biowarfare, bioengineering, but never quite to the level we've seen it today. And that's a result of the place that social media is at. It's also, there's other factors too. There's the diminishing in trust of institutions, and there's the undermining of like the mainstream media. But these communities are organizing on social media. So a recent national poll here in Australia found that 1 in 5 young Australians believe Bill Gates played a role in creating COVID-19. 1 in 5 also believe that COVID is harmless and just a ruse to force people to get vaccines. So these views are dangerous and undermine our ability to tackle the pandemic. But as I mentioned, they're not new. What is new is the concentration of these communities and these conversations online into new groups with people rejecting the opposing views or not even being presented those views, because the content is pushed and people are pushed into these online communities and into these online echo chambers, which means that they're sort of tucked away in these bubbles. And the conversation that happened there is largely unseen and unchecked by mainstream conversation. So I recently met with a Facebook representative who claimed that the company is protecting democracy by refusing to remove content from the public square. And that concept of the public square is built into this, this positioning. But the whole concept of social media being a single public square where all ideas are heard and the best idea wins is just a complete and utter myth. Because social media has created myriad public squares where facts are fit for purpose. You have an entire curated and individually tailored online experience. Your newsfeed is unique and like no one else's. And so truth ends up being relative to whichever bubble you're in. So while conspiracy theories tend to spread thanks to clumsy and unaccountable algorithms that prioritize engagement over factual accuracy, there has been a proliferation of what we call intentional manipulation on social media through the pandemic. We've seen it used by people who are hawking bogus cures for COVID. We've seen Russian trolls try to sow distrust in authorities and undermine Western governments' responses to the crisis. But so often these stories are told through the lens of a malicious actor and often ignore the responsibility that sits with the platforms that enable that action. And so we wanted to demonstrate what's possible through Facebook's ad platform and what you can do. So we ran a little experiment, which I'm going to run you through. So the first thing we did was we created a fake news page. We then created a series of fake COVID content ads, which provided terrible health advice, but dressed up as if it was somewhat legitimate. But we also went further. We threw in some electoral law-breaking voter suppression, telling people in safe electorates that they shouldn't vote because their vote doesn't matter, encouraging young people not to vote. We also created some sort of dog whistle racism to show, to really push the limits of what you're able to put through the platform. And we also threw in some 5G conspiracy theories just for good measure. So we uploaded these ads to Facebook, to the ad platform, fully expecting that they're going to reject these as soon as we upload them, because they not only some of them breach Australian law, they certainly all breach Facebook's community guidelines. And so we uploaded all of them, but they were all reviewed and approved by Facebook's platform. This is despite the claims that Facebook was cracking down on, particularly on COVID misinformation. So we were then in this position where we had these ads, they were ready to kind of go, but we didn't want to push them to the unsuspecting public and contribute to the problem that we're trying to address. So we recruited 100 RTA supporters who were consenting adults who were shown the ads and agreed to being served them. We uploaded them to Facebook and created a custom audience and then hit go and served these ads to just that audience. And we did that for 2 straight months, totally unimpaired by Facebook. But it gets worse than that. So our supporters weren't just passive consumers of these ads. They were following our instructions and using Facebook's own reporting mechanism to report the ads and flag them as misleading, false news, or offensive. And they did that for 2 months. And so I'll admit that the ads were eventually taken down, but that only occurred after the journalist who we'd been speaking to called them for comment. In fact, we never heard from Facebook and still haven't, other than a call that we received last week, which turned out to be from their marketing team, who called us to offer support and training for making our ads more effective. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the problems and the challenges, and I do want to speak about the solutions. So we kind of pan back out and look at these harms. It's important to remember that a lot of these examples, while happening around the world, are happening here too. We know that we're being impacted already. We know that troll farms are profiting from outraging Australians with xenophobic content. We know that the QUT researchers estimate that 13% of all active Twitter accounts in the recent election were bots. We know that Facebook claimed to have removed 2 billion fake accounts just before our last election. So it can no longer be treated as a user beware basis, nor can we continue to tolerate the platform's sort of trust us approach, or the shifting of responsibility to users to report the harms with no transparency on whether actions are taken or not. But so while we're clearly not immune from these harms, we're also not powerless. There are many countries around the world now who are looking at how to regulate big tech and the social media giants. To lay the groundwork for this approach, the first thing we need to do is shift the way we're thinking and talking about regulation. Our current policy approach to dealing with these harms is one of content moderation. It places the onus on the individual based on the idea that there's malicious actors using illegal content to cause harm. And this is true, of course, that happens. And we have the Safety Commission in office who actually does world-leading work in tackling this. But this approach only deals with that explicitly illegal content. It's ill-equipped to address the harms that I've kind of laid out today. It also helps the platforms to shirk responsibility and hide the fact that while they might not be creating the racist, sexist, or harmful content, their algorithms are deciding to curate it into feeds, and so they have responsibility for it. Not to mention whatever else they're profiting from with the lack of oversight on their ad platforms. So we need to expand our understanding of the issues and take an approach to regulating the attention economy, which is, and not the content. Because at the end of the day, the system, the attention economy, represents the extraction of attention and data from people and better explains the social harms. And so to do this, at RTA, we've laid out 3 key policy areas for development. The first one is public oversight, because the reality is that we don't really know the size and shape of the problem. We're on the receiving end of these issues. We see the harms manifest, and we're able to trace them back to social media, but we have no insight into how the algorithms are prioritizing content or to whom, like which communities. We're essentially reverse engineering harms. So all we can do at this point is sort of speculate about how much worse social media is making the COVID crisis, or driving political polarization, or amplifying fringe and extremist voices. And the reason is that there is no public oversight that compels social media platforms to tell us. It is the platforms alone who have the bird's eye view of all of this. So we need them to lift the veil and allow an independent regulator or the public more broadly to get an idea of who is being targeted with what and why. The resistance from these platforms to allow any independent regulatory oversight is no longer justifiable. Zuckerberg himself has said regulate us, but in practice, no one's really been able to do that yet because there's still resistance. They need to be accountable for the impacts of their algorithms. And once this happens, we can then assess the issue and create effective regulation and policies that curb the harms while protecting innovation and business. The second piece of this is that it all starts with your personal data. And so we need to start a conversation about data rights. That is to give Australians agency and control over our data so that we have the power to decide how we are surveilled and monetized. This should start with protecting our children, ensuring that young people aren't surveilled, tracked, and targeted. This is already happening in the UK with the Age Appropriate Design Code, and it's a piece of legislation that sets out to do exactly this. And the last piece is that it was one of digital literacy and transparency. And so this is, again, about putting responsibility back onto the platforms to make sure that their users are informed and aware of how their services are designed. But this should also be paired with significant investments in digital and media literacy programs, particularly for vulnerable communities. So in conclusion, Australia is one of the lucky countries with the size, the institutions, and the impetus to implement responsible social media regulation. And we have a proven track record of tackling big policy problems. We led the world in childhood immunization, the fight against HIV and gun control. We've even taken on big industry before with tobacco plain packaging laws, which has set an example which other countries have been able to follow. So we shouldn't underestimate our ability to show the world the way on social media reform, but the first step starts with more oversight over these opaque algorithms. Thank you.
That was great, Chris. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering if I can go back to foreign interference with democracy. And can I just ask for people listening to Chris to, if you've got any questions, to throw them into the Q&A now, because I am interested. I mean, some of these things just, you know, they just scare me. But the foreign interference, I mean, there's been a lot written, I suppose, around Brexit and also around, I suppose, the Trump examples. Have you seen or know of anything happening here? I mean, is it something that we should be worried about in Australia?
I mean, absolutely, we should be worried about it. There has been some early studies which show that there has been interference by state-backed actors in Australia, though that research is, I wouldn't say is at the point of being conclusive, but given that we've seen the way that different governments and state actors deploy these kind of tactics, like I've seen it in work that we did helping to track hate speech and misinformation in Myanmar around the Rohingya, where we saw Russian-trained individuals, you know, helping to to foster those disinformation campaigns. And so it's sort of like, we know it's happening all over the place, and we shouldn't be sort of sleepwalking into this. Also, we are strategically important, geopolitically, to a lot of countries, and particularly at this point in time. If it's not happening here, it's purely because state actors have not yet decided to do that. It's not that they're not going to. It's only a matter of like when, not if.
Yes, that is a bit scary. And you mentioned that you're a new father. Congratulations. I was wondering, for those that have children in their midst, and even just generally, I suppose, if you're worried about yourself or other people or children being manipulated by some of these algorithms, what can we look out for? What sort of things can we do as concerned parents or friends?
So there's a series of different resources and tools online that help you to kind of better protect your children and young people. And and like, I'll admit that the platforms do try to do this well. So Kids YouTube is a great resource where they put a lot of effort into making sure that there's not crazy harmful content on there, but it's by no means perfect. We've got examples of where it still happens. And we're not advocates for saying don't go on social media, though for young people, don't go on social media. But it's not about not using these platforms. It's just about there is a, like, on the individual side of it, there is a requirement to be more present and aware of what's being consumed. But the other side of it is to call for change on this front. We accept regulation around traditional advertising and traditional media, where we know that if your child's watching the TV at any time of day, pretty much, that they're not going to be exposed to harmful, dreadful content until it's late at night. But on social media, we don't have that, and we can have that. And so it is also about like demanding that change, because I don't agree with the way that the platforms place that responsibility back onto you as a parent. Like, you shouldn't have to worry about that on top of everything else, right? You should be able to know that platforms, particularly those designed for children, are safe. And so it is about calling for better regulation and better oversight, which the government has signaled. The ACCC have signaled as well. Like, their digital platforms inquiry call for a really impressive set of regulations, but it's about providing the public support to government to know that they can take on some of the most powerful companies in the world. Like, they kind of need your voice in that.
Yeah, okay, so that's something we can do. In terms of that journey towards regulation, Andrew Sims here has asked, what needs to happen for an independent regulator to acquire a bird's eye view?
Yeah, it's a great question, and plenty of governments are trying to work this out exactly. So we've seen, like, the French government legislated that Facebook had to allow a team of data scientists into the company and give them access for 2 months to do an audit. And at the end of that 2-month period, those data scientists came out and said, we know nothing. We were shown nothing. They made it opaque. We still don't have any information.
Wow.
That doesn't mean that approach won't work again, but from the RTA perspective and around COVID, what we've been calling for is the lightest touch of this, which is to say, you should be maintaining a live list of the most viral content around COVID, because we know it's not going to be health advice from WHO. It's factual and it's boring. The conspiracies are way more interesting, right? So even doing that would give us an insight into what content is proliferating and showing us amongst which communities, so that the government and health authorities can actually produce legitimate and effective strategies to counter these kind of issues. So that's kind of like the light end. Just start with a live list of the content that's moving around. There's other mechanisms that they've implemented to sort of pretend that they're doing this, which is things like the ad library, which is meant to be this tool that enables you to go and see what anyone is paying for ads, so that you can be transparent. But it's actually really difficult to use. You can't do an analysis through that. You have to know exactly who you're looking for and exactly what you're looking for to be able to see anything. So there's a bunch of ways that they can take initial steps into doing this, which is what we're essentially advocating as our kind of march towards working out exactly what that bird's eye view looks like.
Very interesting. There's another, Rosalind Baker has said that she agrees, but how can the public call the government to call the business world to enforce censorship? It seems like a big ask, Chris. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the censorship issue is something that we come up against a lot, and we are definitely anti-censorship. We don't ever advocate for these platforms to be removing content, because we don't think that, because our concern is the impact on democracy, and so removing content from like that infringement on free speech is a risk to democracy. What we are concerned about is solely around the amplification of that content. And so, that my racist uncle who posts his awful things, like, I'm going to keep telling him not to do that, but I'm not going to say Facebook, you need to take his words down. He has some semblance of a right to post that stuff. But Facebook certainly shouldn't be letting its algorithms recognize that that's getting engagement and then amplifying it into other people's news feeds. And because for us, that action of curating that is equivalent to an editorial decision. It's the same reason why you don't see that stuff, although there's been examples, and over the weekend there was one where some awfully racist stuff made it through into the opinion page of one of the major newspapers. But there is meant to be this like journalistic integrity there that stops that kind of thing. And so it's not about censorship, it's about algorithmic accountability, and it's about not amplifying harmful content. And they already do this, like around the self-harm content. And after Molly Russell in the UK, Instagram did institute a bunch of processes to limit that that content, like to their full credit. So what that tells us is that they can do it. They already do it. They just don't like to talk about that, because it undermines their whole premise of free and open internet and that we don't curate anything. But also, it was only a year later that there was a study that did a new set of tests which saw that like whatever they had done, they'd either stopped doing it or it had become not effective anymore. And that's why, again, regulation, oversight over these kind of issues.
But Chris, Kate's mentioned here, Kate Carruthers, who spoke earlier today, has mentioned, how do you stop the amplification when this is how they make their money? The platforms make their money through the amplification. So,
I mean, to be frank, it's their problem, right? Like from a civil society perspective, we're seeing these harms manifest, and we're essentially at the receiving end, picking up the bill for these impacts to society. While they make obscene profits, let's not talk about how much tax is paid and whether that's a fair share, but we're picking up the bill at the end of that. And for us, it's saying that like we're calling out the issue, we're proposing a set of challenges, and if that affects your business profitability, then that's your problem, because we're not going to accept that at the expense of all of these harms.
I think we're getting the wrap-up music. So I could talk about this all day. I find it incredibly fascinating, and I'm sure everyone on the line does as well. Thank you so much for being part of the inaugural Responsible Tech Summit, Chris, and hopefully we'll be doing this again next year over, and then we'd be able to grab a coffee afterwards. So thank you very much, and all the best to Responsible Tech Australia. We'll make sure that we pass on your details and so forth to people, and they should be looking at your work and supporting it where they can.
Yeah, please reach out, and thank you again for the opportunity. It's been lovely.
Thanks, Chris.